I stared at the metal lock box in my trembling hands, dirt still clinging to its edges as my son's car disappeared down the dark lake road. Inside were documents that would change everything. If only I'd had the courage to look 6 months ago when Harold died, but David had been so convincing, so caring, so concerned about my fragile state of mind. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. My name is Alina Whitman, and at 67 I thought I knew my family. I thought the worst betrayal I'd face was losing my husband Harold to cancer last March. How wrong I was. The real betrayal was still breathing, still smiling at family dinners, still calling me Mom while systematically destroying everything Harold had built for us. It started 2 hours ago when I woke to the sound of shovels hitting dirt outside my lake house bedroom window. I'd come here to Lakeview Falls to escape the constant pressure from David and his wife Sarah about selling our family homes. They'd been relentless since Harold's funeral, always with that concerned tone that made me feel guilty for wanting to grieve in peace. Through the window, I watched my 42-year-old son and 38-year-old daughter-in-law working frantically by moonlight, digging a hole near the old oak tree. Sarah kept glancing toward the house nervously while David wielded the shovel with grim determination. They thought I was asleep, thought I was the helpless widow who needed their guidance for everything from choosing breakfast cereal to managing finances. When they finally left an hour later, I waited another 30 minutes before creeping outside in my robe and slippers. The freshly turned earth was easy to spot, and it didn't take long to dig up what they'd buried. A metal lock box sealed tight against moisture, hidden like stolen treasure. Now I sat on my kitchen floor at 4:00 a.m., too shocked to move to a chair, staring at evidence of a deception so calculated it took my breath away. The documents inside weren't just damaging, they were explosive. Harold's real will, bearing a date 3 months after the one David had presented to the probate court. Bank statements showing transfers I'd never authorized and photographs that made my blood run cold. But the item that shattered my world completely was a handwritten letter from my 16-year-old grandson, Tyler, addressed to his grandfather Harold, just weeks before Harold died. In it, Tyler confessed he'd accidentally overheard David and Sarah planning something terrible, something about making sure the old lady doesn't complicate things. The letter ended with Tyler begging his grandfather to protect me, not knowing Harold would be gone so soon. My hands shook as I realized Tyler must have tried to warn Harold, and now David and Sarah were disposing of evidence that could expose them. I'd always wondered why Tyler had become so distant since his grandfather's death, why he barely spoke at family gatherings anymore. Now I knew he'd been carrying this terrible secret, probably terrified of his own parents. As dawn began to creep through my kitchen windows, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours ago. I wasn't going to be the grieving widow who quietly accepted whatever scraps her family threw her way. I was going to fight back. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep this deception went. And that meant going back to the beginning, to the day Harold died, and everything changed. 6 months ago, Harold drew his last breath while holding my hand in our bedroom, the same room where we'd whispered our dreams for 43 years. I thought that was the worst moment of my life. I was wrong. The worst was still coming, gift wrapped in sympathy castles and false concern. The cancer had taken him slowly, giving us months to say goodbye. During those final weeks, Harold spent hours in his study, organizing papers and making arrangements. He was meticulous that way, always wanting to spare me unnecessary burdens, or so I thought. Ellie, he'd whispered the night before he died, his voice barely audible above the oxygen machine's steady hum. There are things in my desk, important things. Promise me you'll look through everything carefully before you let anyone else handle the paperwork. I'd squeezed his hand, thinking he was worried about insurance documents and bill payments. Don't worry about that now, darling. David said he'd help me with all the business details. Harold's grip tightened with surprising strength. No, Ellie, promise me you'll look first before David. Before anyone. I promise, I'd said, though I was already planning to let David handle the complicated financial matters. Harold had always managed our business affairs, and I felt overwhelmed by the thought of navigating bank accounts and legal documents while grieving. The day after the funeral, David arrived with Sarah and a sympathetic expression that should have triggered alarm bells. Mom, I know this is difficult, but we need to start organizing Dad's papers. The probate process has deadlines, and there are financial accounts that need immediate attention. I was still wearing Harold's cologne-scented cardigan, still jumping every time the phone rang, expecting to hear his voice. The idea of sorting through his personal effects felt like torture. Could we wait a few more days? I'm not ready. Sarah stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Elena, I know it hurts, but delaying these things only makes them harder. David took time off work to help. We should take advantage of that. They meant well, I told myself. They were trying to protect me from additional stress during an impossible time. So I surrendered Harold's study to them, grateful to avoid the pain of touching his personal belongings. For 3 days they worked methodically through filing cabinets and desk drawers while I stayed in the living room, accepting condolence calls and trying to plan a life without my anchor. When David emerged with Harold's will and a stack of financial documents, I trusted his summary without question. Everything's pretty straightforward, Mom. Dad left the house to you, of course, and his retirement accounts. There are some investment portfolios that we'll need to review with the financial advisor. The lake house will need some legal work. There's an issue with the deed that might affect the value. I nodded numbly, overwhelmed by details that seemed impossibly complex. Harold had always handled these matters, explaining them to me in simplified terms when necessary. Without him, I felt like I was drowning in legal terminology and financial jargon. Don't worry about understanding everything right now, Sarah had said, rubbing my shoulder with practiced sympathy. We'll take care of the complicated parts. You just focus on healing. I should have insisted on seeing every document myself. I should have honored Harold's final request to examine everything personally. Instead, I let grief and exhaustion cloud my judgment, allowing my son to guide me through decisions that would shape the rest of my life. 3 weeks later, David presented me with papers to sign. Transfers, authorizations, simplifications, he called them. Just making things easier to manage, Mom. Consolidating accounts so you don't have to worry about so many different statements and passwords. I signed everything, trusting the man I'd raised to always tell me the truth. That night, alone in our too-quiet house, I finally entered Harold's study. His coffee cup still sat on the desk, a ring stain marking his place in a legal journal. I touched his reading glasses still folded beside his laptop, and whispered an apology for breaking my promise. I should have looked then. I should have searched every drawer, examined every document, questioned every decision David had made on my behalf. But grief is a thief that steals clarity along with joy, and I was too broken to think clearly. Now, sitting in my lake house kitchen with Harold's reel spread before me, I understood the true cost of my trust. The question wasn't what David had stolen from me, it was what he planned to steal next. 3 months after Harold's funeral, David started the campaign. It began subtly, like most well-planned betrayals do, with casual observations designed to plant seeds of doubt about my independence. Mom, this house is awfully big for just one person, he'd say during his weekly visits, which had become more frequent and purposeful since Harold died. All these stairs, the maintenance, the property taxes, it's a lot to manage alone. I'd been managing our household finances for 43 years. But suddenly David spoke to me like I was a child who'd never seen a checkbook. When I mentioned getting estimates for roof repairs, he frowned with exaggerated concern. Are you sure you want to invest that kind of money in a house this old? It might be throwing good money after bad. Sarah was even more direct. Elena, you're rattling around in this place like a marble in a shoebox. Wouldn't you be happier somewhere more manageable? Maybe one of those lovely senior communities with activities and people your own age. People my own age. As if 67 meant I needed to be warehoused with other discarded elderly folks playing bingo and discussing medication side effects. Harold had been 71 when he died, but nobody had suggested he move to a senior community. Funny how widowhood automatically aged a woman 20 years in everyone else's estimation. The pressure intensified when Tyler started his junior year of high school. We've been thinking, David announced during Sunday dinner in early June. Tyler's going to need money for college soon. Good colleges are expensive and his grades are good enough for some really prestigious schools. That's wonderful, I said, serving Tyler an extra helping of mashed potatoes. Harold and I always planned to help with college expenses. We set aside money specifically for that. David and Sarah exchanged one of those meaningful looks that excluded me from whatever silent conversation they were having. Well, that's the thing, Mom. The college fund isn't as substantial as Dad might have led you to believe. There were some investment losses, some unexpected expenses from his medical treatments. This was news to me. Harold had been proudly tracking Tyler's college fund for years, showing me statements that reflected steady growth. But when I asked to see current documents, David's explanation became vague and complicated. The thing is, Sarah jumped in, if you sold this house and the lake house, invested the proceeds properly, you could live very comfortably in a smaller place and help Tyler get the education he deserves. Tyler, who'd been unusually quiet during these family discussions, suddenly looked up from his plate. I don't need expensive colleges. I can go to community college first, save money. Nonsense, David said firmly. You're not settling for community college when you could get into Princeton or Yale. Your grandmother wants what's best for you, don't you, Mom? The manipulation was subtle but effective. They were positioning me as either generous or selfish, supportive or neglectful. Refusing to sell the houses meant I was prioritizing my own comfort over my grandson's future. I need time to think about this, I said, though part of me was already calculating how much the properties might be worth. Of course, Sarah said smoothly, we're not trying to pressure you, we just want you to have all the information you need to make the best decision. But the information kept changing. The roof repairs I'd planned became a money pit in David's assessment. The lake house I'd always treasured became a burden, requiring constant maintenance. The neighborhood where Harold and I had raised our family became too isolated for a woman living alone. Every conversation steered back to the same conclusion. I should sell everything, downsize dramatically, and trust them to manage the proceeds for everyone's benefit. They painted pictures of cozy apartments with no maintenance responsibilities, senior communities with built-in social networks and investment strategies that would ensure financial security for all of us. What they never acknowledged was what I'd be losing. The garden where I'd grown vegetables for 4 decades, the kitchen where I'd taught David to make Christmas cookies, the porch where Harold and I had shared our morning coffee for 20 years, the lake house where 3 generations of our family had created summer memories. But grief makes you vulnerable to others' certainty, and I began to doubt my own judgment. Maybe they were right, maybe I was being selfish. Clinging to houses I couldn't properly maintain while Tyler's future hung in the balance. The night I almost capitulated, I found myself standing in Harold's study again, surrounded by the absence of papers David had already removed. That's when I remembered Harold's strange urgency about examining everything carefully. I'd promised him I'd look through everything myself, and I'd broken that promise. But it wasn't too late to honor his final request, even if it meant challenging the son I'd trusted with everything. 2 weeks ago I made the decision that probably saved my life, though I didn't know it at the time. I announced I was going to the lake house alone for some reflection and peace, and the reaction from David and Sarah should have been my first clue that something was seriously wrong. Mom, that's not safe, David said immediately. The lake house has been empty for months. What if something happens? What if you fall and no one knows? Sarah nodded vigorously. Eleanor, you shouldn't isolate yourself like that. It's not healthy to grieve alone. Why don't we all go together, make it a family weekend? The idea of sharing my sanctuary with their constant chatter about selling properties and downsizing made me feel claustrophobic. I need some time by myself. I haven't had a moment of solitude since Harold died. But Mom, David pressed, you've never stayed there alone. Dad always handled the maintenance issues, turned on the utilities, checked the plumbing. What if something goes wrong? I looked at my 42-year-old son, the boy I'd raised to be independent and resourceful, now treating me like I was incapable of managing a weekend at a house where I'd spent every summer for 30 years. David, I'm 67, not 97. I think I can handle turning on water and checking that the electricity works. The conversation escalated into the first real argument we'd had since Harold's death. David insisted I was being reckless and stubborn. Sarah worried about my emotional state and suggested I was running away from necessary decisions about my future. Tyler, who'd been quietly doing homework at the kitchen table, finally looked up. Maybe Grandma just wants some space to think, he said quietly. Everyone needs that sometimes. David rounded on his son with unexpected sharpness. Tyler, this isn't your concern. Your grandmother is going through a difficult time and needs family support, not encouragement to isolate herself. Something in Tyler's expression shifted. A careful blankness that reminded me of how I'd learned to look when David was in one of his controlling moods. My grandson glanced at me, then quickly away, but not before I caught something that looked like worry in his eyes. I'm leaving tomorrow morning, I announced, standing up to end the discussion. I'll call you when I get there so you know I arrived safely, and I'll be back Sunday evening. This is a mistake, Mom, David said, his voice tight with frustration. You're not thinking clearly. As I prepared to leave the next morning, packing comfortable clothes and my favorite books, I felt a mixture of liberation and apprehension. I hadn't been truly alone since Harold's diagnosis 2 years ago. There had always been medical appointments, treatment schedules, family obligations, and after his death, an endless stream of well-meaning visitors who seemed to think silence was dangerous for widows. The drive to Lake Michigan took 3 hours, and with each mile I felt tension leaving my shoulders. The lake house sat on 2 acres of wooded property with 200 ft of private shoreline. Harold had bought it 40 years ago when David was barely 2, back when lakefront property was affordable for a middle-class engineer and his teacher wife. The house itself was modest. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a great room with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen with windows overlooking the water. But it was our sanctuary, the place where we'd escaped work pressures and parenting stress, where we'd reconnected with each other and with the natural world. As I unlocked the front door, I was hit by the familiar smell of cedar and lake air, tinged now with the mustiness of a house closed up too long. Harold's fishing poles still hung on the wall hooks. His favourite coffee mug sat in the dish drainer where I'd left it after washing it the last morning we were here together. I spent the first day simply being. I sat on the deck watching boats move across the lake. I walked the shoreline collecting smooth stones. I made simple meals and ate them in peaceful silence. For the first time in months I felt like myself again, not the grieving widow everyone expected me to be, not the burden David and Sarah saw. When they looked at me, that evening I called David as promised. I'm here safely, the house is fine and I'm fine. Good, he said, though his voice carried an edge of continued disapproval. Sarah and I were thinking we might drive up tomorrow evening, bring you some groceries, check on things. That's not necessary, I bought everything I need. Mom, we worry about you being there alone. What if David, I interrupted, surprising both of us with the firmness in my voice. I need this time, please respect that. After hanging up, I made another decision that turned out to be crucial. I turned off my phone. For the first time since Harold's death, I was completely unreachable, completely disconnected from everyone else's expectations and demands. I had no way of knowing that within 24 hours that decision would probably save me from becoming another statistic, an elderly widow whose convenient accident eliminated complications for her loving family. The morning after I discovered what David and Sarah had buried, I stood in my kitchen holding evidence of betrayal so profound it made my knees weak. But along with the shock came something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. Harold's voice echoed in my memory. Look through everything carefully before you let anyone else handle the paperwork. He'd known. Somehow my husband had sensed what our son was capable of and tried to warn me. The real will was dated February 15th, just 6 weeks before Harold died, while the version David had shown me was dated the previous November. The differences were staggering. In Harold's real will, I inherited everything outright. The house, the lake house, all investments, all retirement accounts. David and Sarah were mentioned only as contingent beneficiaries if something happened to me. But in the fake will David had presented, everything was structured differently. The properties were left to David in trust for my benefit, with him having control over decisions about selling or maintaining them. The investment accounts were jointly managed, requiring his approval for any withdrawals over $1,000. I'd been living as a guest in my own life, asking permission for decisions that should have been mine alone. The bank statements in the lockbox told an even more sinister story. 3 separate accounts I'd never heard of, all opened after Harold's death, all funded by transfers from accounts I thought David was simplifying for my benefit. Nearly $400,000 had been moved without my knowledge or consent, but it was Tyler's letter that broke my heart completely. Written in the careful handwriting of a boy trying to be a man, it laid out everything he'd overheard during a late-night conversation between his parents. Dear Grandpa, the letter began. I don't know who else to tell, and I'm scared if I say anything, Mom and Dad will get in trouble. But I heard them talking about Grandma, and I think she's in danger. Tyler described overhearing David and Sarah discussing how to handle the Alina problem after Harold died, how they planned to present a modified will that would give David control over the properties, how they'd gradually convince me to sell everything using Tyler's college expenses as leverage. But the most chilling part was Tyler's account of a conversation about what to do if I ever discovered their deception. Dad said, if Grandma ever figured things out, accidents happen to old people all the time, especially ones living alone in big houses or isolated lakeus. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Harold's death. My grandson had been carrying this terrible knowledge for 6 months, watching his parents manipulate me while knowing what they were truly capable of. I had to call Tyler, but first I needed to secure this evidence somewhere David couldn't reach it. I drove to the small town 20 minutes from the lake house and rented a safety deposit box at the local bank, placing copies of everything inside. The originals went into a manila envelope addressed to my longtime friend Margaret with instructions to open it if anything happened to me. Back at the lake house, I finally turned my phone back on. 17 missed calls from David, 12 from Sarah, and 3 voicemails with increasingly frantic tones. Mom, please call us back. We're worried sick. This isn't like you to disappear like this. But there was also one text message from Tyler sent at 3:00. Grandma, are you okay? Dad and Mom went out late last night and came back really upset. Please be careful. My hands shook as I called him, praying he'd answer before his parents realized I was trying to contact him. "Grandma," Tyler's voice was barely a whisper. "Tyler, sweetheart, I'm fine, but I need to ask you something very important. The letter you wrote to Grandpa before he died, do you remember what you wrote?" Silence stretched between us for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Tyler spoke, his voice thick with tears. "You found it. They went to get it last night, didn't they?" "I knew they would eventually. Tyler, what you overheard, what you tried to warn Grandpa about, is it still happening? Grandma, you have to get away from there. Dad's been planning this for months. He says you're going to have an accident at the lake house because you're too stubborn to listen to reason about selling it." The words hit me like ice water. David hadn't just been pressuring me to sell the properties. He'd been planning to eliminate me as an obstacle. "Tyler, I need you to listen carefully. Can you get away from your parents for a few hours today without them suspecting anything?" "I think so. I'm supposed to go to soccer practice after school." "Skip practice. Meet me at the Riverside Diner on Highway 32 at 4:00. Don't tell anyone where you're going." After hanging up, I looked around the lake house with new eyes. Every isolated corner, every steep staircase, every spot where an elderly woman might plausibly have a fatal accident. David had been planning this place to be my tomb, but instead it was going to be the site of our family's reckoning. At the Riverside Diner, Tyler slumped across from me in a corner booth, looking older than his 16 years. The boy who used to chatter excitedly about school and sports sat picking at a hamburger he hadn't ordered, while I tried to process how my own son had terrorized his child into becoming an accomplice to potential murder. "Grandma, I've been so scared," Tyler whispered, glancing toward the door every few seconds. "I wanted to warn you after Grandpa died, but Dad said if I ever mentioned what I heard, he'd make sure I never saw you again. He said you were getting old and confused, and that people might not believe me anyway." The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. David had isolated Tyler from the one person who could have helped him, turning the boy's love for me into a weapon against both of us. "Tell me everything, sweetheart. Start from the beginning." Tyler's story unfolded like a nightmare. He'd been sick with strep throat the night he overheard the conversation, staying home while his parents thought he was asleep. David and Sarah had been in the kitchen, voices low but urgent, discussing what Tyler called the plan. "Mom said you were more stubborn than they expected, that you weren't automatically agreeing to sell the houses like they thought you would." Dad was angry because he'd already started spending the money. "What money?" "From your accounts." He showed Mom bank statements and said he'd moved money around to make investments, but that if you ever hired your own lawyer or accountant, they'd be in huge trouble. This explained David's increasingly frantic pressure about the properties. He wasn't just planning for future theft. He'd already stolen from me and needed to cover his tracks before I discovered the missing funds. "Dad said the problem was you were healthier than most widows your age, that you could live another 20 years and complicate everything. Mom suggested maybe you could have an accident, something that looked natural." Tyler's voice cracked as he continued. Dad liked that idea. He said, "Old people fall downstairs all the time or have accidents at lake houses because they're trying to do things they used to do when their husbands were alive to help them." The casual way my son had discussed my murder made my blood run cold. This wasn't a desperate decision born from financial pressure. This was calculated planning by people who saw me as an inconvenient obstacle to their inheritance. "Tyler, when you wrote to Grandpa, did he ever respond?" "Kind of. He started asking me weird questions about Mom and Dad, about their money situation, about whether I ever heard them fighting about bills. I think he was investigating." But then he got sicker and Tyler's voice trailed off. The pieces clicked together. Harold had sensed something was wrong and started digging deeper into David's activities. That's when he'd created the new will, the real will, leaving everything directly to me without David's involvement. Harold had been protecting me even as cancer was stealing his strength. "Grandma, there's something else." Last month, Dad started talking about the lake house again, saying, maybe you'd finally agree to sell it if you had a bad experience there. He and Mom have been Googling things about accidents and how investigations work when old people die alone. I gripped Tyler's hand across the table. "Sweetheart, you probably saved my life by writing that letter. Grandpa made sure I'd find it when I needed it most. What are we going to do? Dad will know I talked to you. He always knows everything." Looking at my grandson's frightened face, I felt rage replace fear. David and Sarah hadn't just betrayed me. They'd traumatized a child, forced him to carry adult secrets and adult terror. They'd poisoned his sense of safety within his own family. "Tyler, I want you to go home and act completely normal. Don't mention seeing me. Don't ask any questions about last night. Just be a regular teenager worried about homework and soccer practice." "But what if Dad, your father, isn't going to hurt you because I'm going to give him much bigger problems to worry about?" Tomorrow morning I'm driving back to town, and I'm going to have some very interesting conversations with people your parents never expected me to contact. As Tyler left for home, I sat in the diner planning my next moves. David and Sarah thought they were dealing with a grief-stricken widow, too dependent and trusting to challenge their authority. They had no idea they just declared war on a woman who'd finally found her strength. Harold's voice whispered in my memory one more time. Look through everything carefully. I had my darling husband, and what I'd found was going to destroy the people who tried to destroy us both. Tomorrow the real reckoning would begin. Monday morning at 9 sharp, I walked into the law offices of Patterson and Associates, carrying my purse and 43 years of marriage to a man who'd protected me even in death. James Patterson, no relation to the novelist but equally good at handling twisted plots. Listened to my story without interrupting once. Mrs. Whitman, he said when I finished, what you're describing constitutes multiple felonies, document forgery, elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and if your grandson's account is accurate, conspiracy to commit murder. I'd chosen Patterson because Harold had mentioned him years ago as someone who specialized in estate disputes and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when protecting elderly clients. He looked like someone's grandfather with his silver hair and reading glasses, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man who'd seen every kind of family betrayal imaginable. What I need to know is whether we have enough evidence to stop them permanently. Patterson studied the documents I'd spread across his conference table. Oh, we have more than enough. The question is whether you want to pursue criminal charges or handle this as a civil matter. What's the difference? Criminal charges mean David and Sarah could face jail time. Civil proceedings focus on recovering your assets and establishing legal protections. Criminal is more public, more devastating to their reputations, but also more uncertain in terms of timeline. I thought about Tyler, terrified and carrying secrets that should never burden a child. I thought about Harold spending his final weeks trying to protect me from our own son. I thought about myself, nearly murdered for the crime of being inconveniently healthy. I want to do both. I want them arrested, and I want every penny they stole returned with interest. Patterson smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. Mrs. Whitman, I think we're going to get along very well. Now, before we contact law enforcement, I need you to do something that might feel counterintuitive. I want you to go home and act completely normal. Normal, don't confront them about what you've discovered. Don't change your routine. Act like the grieving widow they expect you to be. Let them think their midnight burial mission was successful. He pulled out a recording device smaller than a credit card. However, I want you to wear this during any conversations with David or Sarah. If they discuss their plans for you, either past or future, we want it documented. The device felt cold against my palm. You want me to spy on my own family. Mrs. Whitman, your family has been planning to murder you for financial gain. At this point, protecting yourself isn't spying. It's survival. That afternoon, I drove home from the lake house, called David to let him know I'd returned safely, and invited him and Sarah for dinner the following evening. My voice carried just the right note of lonely vulnerability. That's wonderful. Mom, David said, relief evident in his tone, we missed you. Sarah was worried sick. I spent Tuesday preparing Harold's favorite meal. Pot roast with vegetables, homemade rolls, and apple pie. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was cooking my husband's favorites for the people who'd stolen his final gift to me. When David and Sarah arrived, they seemed unusually relaxed, almost cheerful. David actually hugged me, something he'd rarely done since adolescence. You look rested, Mom. The lake house was good for you. It was peaceful, I agreed, activating the recording device Patterson had given me. Very quiet. Sometimes you don't realize how much you need solitude until you have it. Over dinner, they returned to their familiar theme with renewed enthusiasm. Sarah mentioned touring a lovely senior community that had activities and social opportunities. David had information about a financial advisor who specialized in helping elderly clients maximize their retirement security. The thing is, Mom, David said, cutting into his pot roast, the real estate market is really strong right now. If you're going to sell, this is the perfect time. Sell, well, we've been thinking. After your weekend alone at the lake house, you must have realized how isolated it is. What if something had happened? What if you'd fallen or had a medical emergency? Sarah nodded earnestly. We were so worried, Alina, 3 days without hearing from you properly. It really drove home how vulnerable you are in these big empty houses. They painted their concern so skillfully that if I hadn't known the truth, I might have been touched by their caring. Instead, I watched my son manipulate me with the same casual expertise he'd probably used to sell insurance to unwilling customers. I suppose you're right, I said slowly. I did feel rather isolated there. David leaned forward, sensing victory. Exactly. And the house here is just as problematic as all these stairs, this big yard to maintain. You could have a nice apartment, Mom. Something modern and safe with neighbors close by. What about Tyler's college fund? I asked. Would selling the houses generate enough to help with that? The look that passed between David and Sarah was so quick I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching for it. Sarah's hand briefly touched David's arm under the table. Actually, Mom, Tyler's grades haven't been as strong as we hoped. He might not qualify for the kind of schools we were considering. This was news to me. Tyler had been an honor student since middle school. What happened to his grades? Oh, you know how teenagers are, David said vaguely, distracted by video games and social media. Maybe community college would be a better fit anyway. I realized with growing horror that they'd already written off Tyler's education, probably planning to keep the money that was supposed to secure his future. Their theft wasn't just from me. They were stealing from their own son. After they left, I sat in my quiet kitchen and called Patterson's emergency number. They're accelerating their timeline, I told him. Something about my lake house trip spooked them. They want everything sold and settled as quickly as possible. Good, Patterson said grimly. Desperate people make mistakes, and we're going to catch every single one. Wednesday morning brought the knock on my door that would shatter my family forever. I opened it to find 2 FBI agents, a state police detective and James Patterson, all wearing expressions that meant business. Mrs. Whitman, Agent Rebecca Martinez said, showing her credentials. We have a warrant to search these premises for evidence related to financial crimes and conspiracy charges. We also have arrest warrants for David Michael Whitman and Sarah Catherine Whitman. I stepped aside to let them in, though my hands were shaking. Despite everything I knew, seeing federal agents in my living room made the nightmare feel suddenly, devastatingly real. Patterson touched my arm gently. Eleanor, they found additional evidence when they searched David's home this morning. The scope of this goes beyond what we originally discovered. What kind of additional evidence? Agent Martinez answered. Computer records showing extensive research into methods of elderly death that wouldn't trigger investigations. Internet searches for untraceable poisons, accident scenarios, and legal precedents for contesting elderly suicides. My legs gave out and I sank into Harold's old armchair. Suicide. They developed a backup plan in case staging an accident proved too difficult. Your son researched how to make murder look like depression-related suicide by an elderly widow. Detective Williams, a woman about my age with kind eyes and steel in her voice, knelt beside my chair. Mrs. Whitman, we found Tyler's original letter to his grandfather, and we found your son's response to discovering it. David knew Tyler had written to Harold. He found the letter among your husband's papers after the funeral, but instead of destroying it, he kept it, probably as insurance in case Tyler ever tried to tell anyone what he'd overheard. They showed me printouts of text messages between David and Sarah, discussing whether Tyler needed to be handled as a potential problem. The casual way they discussed frightening their own child into silence made me physically ill. Where are they now? I asked. David was arrested at his office an hour ago. Sarah was taken into custody at their home. Tyler is with Child Protective Services temporarily until we can determine the safest placement for him. I want him here, I said immediately. Tyler should be with family who actually love him. Patterson nodded. Well arranged that, Eleanor. But first, we need to finish documenting everything they took from you. The search of my house revealed David's methodical theft went far beyond what I discovered in the lockbox. They found Harold's personal computer, which David had claimed was broken and unusable. Harold's financial records, which David said had been destroyed in a water leak. Even Harold's watch and wedding ring, which David claimed had been buried with his father, but had actually been sold to fund their lifestyle. But the most devastating discovery was Harold's medical records, which revealed something David and Sarah couldn't have known when they made their plans. Harold hadn't just suspected their intentions. He'd been gathering evidence against them for months before his death. Your husband contacted the FBI 6 weeks before he died, Agent Martinez explained. He suspected financial irregularities and wanted to ensure your protection after his death. He'd been documenting suspicious conversations, unusual interest in his business affairs, and David's attempts to gain access to accounts that should have been private. Harold had died knowing his son was planning to betray us, but he'd also died knowing I would have the protection and evidence I needed to survive that betrayal. Even facing his own mortality, my husband had been 3 steps ahead of the people who thought they could outsmart him. That evening, Tyler arrived with a social worker and a small suitcase, looking younger than his 16 years and older than he should ever have needed to be. "Grandma," he whispered as I hugged him. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, I was so scared. You did exactly what you needed to do to survive, sweetheart. You have nothing to apologize for. As we sat together on the couch where Harold used to read him bedtime stories, Tyler told me about the morning his parents were arrested. How Sarah had screamed at the officers that this was all a misunderstanding. How David had tried to convince everyone that I was a confused elderly woman being manipulated by predatory lawyers. Dad kept saying you were senile, that you couldn't be trusted to make your own decisions. Even when they were putting handcuffs on him, he was telling the agents that you needed psychiatric evaluation. David's final insult was trying to paint me as incompetent while he was being arrested for planning my murder. Some things I realized never change. But looking at Tyler's relieved face, seeing him safe and free to tell the truth for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Harold's diagnosis. Hope for the future. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, and James Patterson warned me it would be brutal. David and Sarah have hired excellent attorneys who are going to try every possible defense. They'll claim you're mentally incompetent, that Tyler's statements are unreliable adolescent fantasy, that Harold was paranoid in his final weeks. But I wasn't prepared for the actual viciousness of their attack on my character and sanity. Sarah's attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Jennifer Hartley, painted me as a delusional widow whose grief had warped her perception of reality. She claimed I'd misinterpreted normal family concern as sinister plotting, that I'd imagined threats where none existed. Mrs. Whitman's behavior since her husband's death has become increasingly erratic, Hartley argued. Her decision to disappear to an isolated lake house without informing her family demonstrates a concerning detachment from reality. Her accusations against her own son stem from an elderly woman's paranoid fears about losing her independence. David's attorney, a distinguished man who radiated false sincerity, took a different approach. He portrayed David as a devoted son, trying to protect an aging mother who couldn't accept her diminished capabilities. David Whitman has done nothing but try to ensure his mother's safety and financial security. Every action he took was in consultation with financial advisors and attorneys following proper legal channels. Mrs. Whitman's current allegations are the product of manipulation by lawyers who smell a lucrative elder law case. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to my own family's attorneys systematically dismantle my credibility, I felt the familiar weight of being dismissed as a hysterical old woman. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was I overreacting? Had grief clouded my judgment? Then Tyler took the stand. My 16-year-old grandson sat straight in the witness chair and calmly, clearly, devastatingly recounted exactly what he'd heard his parents planning. And Sarah's attorney tried to rattle him by suggesting he'd misunderstood adult conversations. Tyler looked her in the eye and said, "Ma'am, I've been listening to my parents talk about money my whole life. I know the difference between discussing bills and planning someone's death." The courtroom went silent. When David's attorney suggested Tyler might be angry with his parents for normal teenage reasons, Tyler's response was even more damaging. "Sir, I love my parents. That's why this has been so hard. But I love my grandmother more than I love keeping family secrets that could get her killed." But the moment that sealed David and Sarah's fate came when the prosecutor played recordings from Harold's hidden security system. My husband, brilliant even in his final weeks, had installed voice-activated recording devices in his study after becoming suspicious of David's frequent visits to help with paperwork. The recording was crystal clear. David and Sarah discussing how to modify Harold's will, how to gain control of the financial accounts, and yes, how to ensure I wouldn't live long enough to discover their theft. The old man's taking forever to die. David's voice filled the courtroom. If this drags on much longer, Mom might start asking questions about why we need so many documents signed. Sarah's response was equally damning. Maybe after he's gone, we can encourage her to take some risks. Old women fall downstairs all the time, especially when they're living alone in houses that are too big for them. David's face went white as his own words condemned him. Sarah started crying, but not the tears of remorse, the angry tears of someone whose perfect plan had been destroyed by evidence she never knew existed. The judge denied bail for both defendants, citing flight risk and the severity of the charges. As they were led away in handcuffs, David turned to look at me one last time. "You'll regret this, Mom," he called out, his mask finally slipping completely. "You'll die alone in that house, and it'll serve you right, even facing prison." My son's last words to me were a curse. I realized then that the David I thought I'd raised, the boy I'd loved and nurtured, had perhaps never existed at all. But Tyler was beside me, his hand in mine, proof that love and decency could survive even in a family poisoned by greed and betrayal. Outside the courthouse, Patterson handed me a folder thick with financial documents. Eleanor, there's something else you need to know. The money David stole from you, he didn't just spend it on luxuries. He'd been gambling, making high-risk investments, trying to multiply it quickly. How much is left? Patterson's expression was grim. About 30,000 out of the 400,000 he took. The rest is gone. I looked at Tyler, who was listening with the expression of someone much older than 16. Well, I said, surprised by the lightness in my own voice. I suppose it's a good thing I still have 2 houses to sell after all. 3 weeks after the preliminary hearing, Tyler and I were cleaning out Harold's study when we discovered something that changed everything we thought we knew about my husband's final months. Hidden behind a false back in Harold's desk drawer was a manila envelope marked for Alina final insurance policy. Inside were documents that revealed Harold hadn't just been protecting me from David's theft. He'd been protecting Tyler from something far worse. Grandma, Tyler said quietly. What's a paternity test? My hands stilled on the papers. According to the documents Harold had compiled, David wasn't Tyler's biological father. DNA testing Harold had secretly arranged showed that Tyler was actually the son of Sarah's college boyfriend. A fact Sarah had hidden from everyone, including David. But Harold had discovered Sarah's secret when he noticed Tyler's blood type on medical records didn't match what should have been possible with David's genetics. Further investigation revealed Sarah had been receiving money from Tyler's biological father for years. Money she'd been hiding from David and using for her own purposes. Tyler, sweetheart, this doesn't change anything about how much you're loved, but it explains some things about why your parents were so desperate for money from my accounts. Sarah had been living a triple life, lying to David about Tyler's parentage, lying to Tyler's biological father about David's financial situation, and stealing from all 3 sources to maintain her lifestyle. When Harold discovered this, he'd realized the depth of deception in his son's marriage. But there was more. Harold's notes revealed he'd confronted Sarah privately about the paternity issue, offering to keep her secret in exchange for her leaving our family alone after his death. Sarah had agreed, promising to convince David to stop pressuring me about the properties. Instead, she'd escalated her plans, realizing that Harold's knowledge made her vulnerable to exposure even after his death. If I remained alive and sharp enough to ask questions, eventually the truth about Tyler's parentage might come to light, destroying her marriage and her access to both David's future inheritance and Tyler's biological father's support money. She wasn't just planning to kill me for David's inheritance, I told Patterson when he arrived that evening. She was planning to kill me to protect her own secrets. Patterson studied the DNA results and Sarah's financial records that Harold had meticulously documented. Eleanor, this gives us leverage we didn't have before. Sarah's been committing fraud against Tyler's biological father for 16 years. She's been claiming David couldn't afford child support while simultaneously stealing from you to fund her lifestyle. Tyler sat quietly through this explanation, processing information that redefined his entire understanding of his family. Finally, he looked up at me with Harold's intelligent eyes. Does this mean David isn't really my dad? David raised you, sweetheart. That makes him your dad in all the ways that matter. But it also means you have a biological father who's been trying to support you financially all these years without knowing. David was well off enough to provide for you himself. That evening, Patterson contacted Tyler's biological father, Dr. Michael Chen, a pediatric surgeon in California who'd been sending Sarah monthly support checks for 16 years under the impression that David was a struggling teacher, unable to provide for his son. Dr. Chen's response was immediate and decisive. He wanted to meet Tyler, wanted to establish a relationship, and wanted Sarah prosecuted for the fraud she'd perpetrated against both his family and ours. But mostly, Patterson told us after speaking with Dr. Chen, he wants to ensure Tyler has every opportunity for the future that he's been trying to provide all along, including a college fund that Sarah never told anyone about. Tyler learned he had a half-sister in California, a stepmother who'd known about him for years, and a biological father who'd never stopped hopping to be part of his life. Most importantly, he learned he had a family who'd been trying to love and support him from afar, just as I'd been loving and supporting him up close. The next morning brought news that Sarah had been rushed to the prison medical facility after what guards described as a complete emotional breakdown. When confronted with evidence of her 16-year fraud against Dr. Chen, she'd confessed to everything in a desperate attempt to negotiate a plea deal. She gave up David completely, Patterson informed me, confirmed that the murder plot was his idea originally, that she'd encouraged it because she needed you silenced permanently. She's hoping cooperation will reduce her sentence. David's response to Sarah's betrayal was swift and vicious. Through his attorney, he demanded Tyler be subjected to questioning about his false memories and coach testimony. He wanted Tyler's biological parentage investigated, claiming Sarah had manipulated the DNA results as part of her scheme against our family. Even facing life in prison, David was still trying to destroy a child who done nothing but tell the truth. But Tyler had something David never expected. A biological father with resources, connections, and 16 years of suppressed protective instincts finally unleashed. Dr. Chen's first act, as Tyler's acknowledged father, was hiring his own team of attorneys to ensure David could never hurt his son again. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my downsized house. Not because David and Sarah had forced me to sell, but because I'd chosen to buy something smaller and more manageable for an active 70-year-old woman with a busy life ahead of her. Tyler lived with me full-time now. Though he spent summers in California with Dr. Chen and his half-sister, Lisa, the boy, who'd been silent and withdrawn at family dinners, was now a confident young man planning to study Premd, following in his biological father's footsteps. David had been sentenced to 15 years for elder financial abuse, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Sarah received 12 years after her cooperation and testimony. Both would be eligible for parole in 7 years, assuming good behavior. I'd recovered most of my stolen money through asset seizures and insurance claims. The life insurance policy Harold had secretly increased just before his death ensured that even with David's gambling losses, Tyler and I were financially secure, but the real treasure had been Harold's final gift to both of us. The truth. Tyler was frosting a birthday cake when the doorbell rang. Through the window I saw a familiar figure that made my heart skip, not with fear this time but with surprise. Jennifer Hartley, Sarah's former attorney, stood on my porch looking nothing like the sharp-faced woman who'd tried to destroy my credibility in court. "Mrs. Whitman," she said when I opened the door, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I have something that belongs to you." She handed me a sealed envelope marked with Harold's handwriting. "For Elelina's 68th birthday, your husband gave this to me 2 years ago with specific instructions. He said, if anything ever happened to him under suspicious circumstances, I should ensure you receive this on your 68th birthday, which is today." Inside was a letter in Harold's careful script, written when he was still healthy, still planning for a future he somehow knew might be cut short. "My dearest Elena," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then the worst has happened. But you've survived it. I always knew you were stronger than you realized, stronger than I probably ever told you often enough." Harold had written about his pride in our marriage, his love for our life together, and his absolute confidence that I would find happiness and purpose beyond grief. But the final paragraph took my breath away. "I've arranged for one final surprise, my darling. Check the safe deposit box we opened for our 25th anniversary, the one you probably forgot about. Inside you'll find documents for the little cottage by the lake in Vermont where we honeymooned. I bought it 3 years ago as a surprise for your retirement. It's yours now, a place to build new memories while honoring the old ones." Tyler looked up from his cake decorating as I finished reading, my eyes bright with tears that were joy instead of grief for the first time in months. "Good news, Grandma. The best news, sweetheart. Your grandfather left us one more treasure to discover." That evening, as Tyler and I celebrated my 68th birthday with Dr. Chen joining us via video call from California, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. I'd lost the son I thought I'd raised, but I'd gained custody of a grandson I was truly able to protect. I'd discovered betrayal that could have destroyed me, but I'd also discovered strength I never knew I possessed. Most importantly, I'd learned that Harold's love had been the greatest gift of my life. Not because it made me dependent, but because it had made me strong enough to survive anything, even losing him. The phone rang as we were cleaning up birthday dishes. Tyler answered with the easy confidence of a young man who no longer feared unexpected calls. "Grandma," he said, holding out the phone with a grin. "It's Margaret from your book club. She wants to know if you're still planning to lead the discussion on that mystery novel next week." I took the phone, thinking about Harold's letter, about the Vermont cottage waiting to be discovered, about the future I was finally free to plan for myself. "Tell Margaret I'll be there," I said, "and that I've got some incredible stories to share about how the most shocking plot twists always come from the people you least suspect." Outside, the autumn evening was crisp with possibility. Inside, Tyler was doing homework while video chatting with his half-sister about college plans. Upstairs, Harold's wedding ring sat in my jewelry box next to the birthday earrings Tyler had given me. For the first time since Harold's death, I wasn't haunted by what I'd lost. I was excited about what I still had left to discover. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.